The sun was just beginning to set over the ranch, casting a warm golden glow over the vast fields of land. The wind rustled the tall grass as it swept across the open plains, and the sound of cattle grazing in the distance could be heard in the peaceful silence. It was the kind of evening Caleb loved, the quiet, the solitude, and the endless stretch of land that seemed to go on forever. Caleb Mitchell was a man of few words. He preferred the company of animals to people, and the hard work of the ranch to any kind of social gathering. He had inherited the land from his father, who had passed away years ago and had been running the ranch on his own ever since. Caleb had always kept to himself, working day after day without complaint, finding comfort in the routines of life on the ranch. But recently, something had changed. Caleb had noticed a new neighbor had moved into the old farmhouse just down the road from his ranch. It was a small, weathered house that had been vacant for years, but now there was someone living there. He didn't know much about her, just that her name was Emily. She had moved in with her young son, and Caleb often saw them from a distance as he worked on his land. At first, he didn't pay much attention. People came and went in the area all the time. But something about Emily caught his eye. He would sometimes catch glimpses of her standing in the yard, staring off into the distance as though lost in her thoughts. There was a sadness in her eyes, a kind of quiet grief that Caleb could feel even from afar. It wasn't that Caleb wanted to get involved. He didn't need or want to know anyone. He had his own work to focus on. And the last thing he needed was the complications of other people's problems. But there were moments when he couldn't help but wonder about Emily and the life she was trying to build in the old farmhouse. One evening, after finishing his work with the cattle, Caleb noticed Emily standing by the fence that separated their properties. She was looking out at the sunset, her shoulders slumped as if the weight of the world was on them. Her son was playing in the yard, running around with a ball, but Emily's gaze seemed distant, lost in thoughts of something or someone. Caleb stood for a moment, watching her. He didn't want to stare, but there was something about the way she looked, so alone, so wrapped up in her own sorrow, that made him feel like he should do something. He quickly shook his head, trying to push the thought away. Mind your own business, Caleb, he told himself. It was easier that way. The next day, Caleb was working near the edge of his property when Emily appeared again, this time with a shovel in hand. She was digging near the back of her house, sweat dripping down her face as she worked under the hot afternoon sun. Caleb watched from a distance, noticing how determined she was, even though her movements seemed heavy and slow, as if she were tired. He felt a pang of sympathy for her. He didn't know why, but seeing her struggle like that made him want to help. But he kept his distance. It wasn't his place to get involved. Still, he couldn't help but watch her for a few more moments before turning back to his work. Later that afternoon, as Caleb was finishing up his chores, he saw Emily again. This time, she was walking along the dirt road that led to her farmhouse, her son following behind her. The little boy was laughing, chasing after her, and for a brief moment, Caleb saw a smile on Emily's face. It was faint, but it was there. She doesn't seem so lonely now, Caleb thought to himself. But even so, he knew it wasn't enough. The smile was just a mask, a temporary shield against whatever pain she was carrying inside. He could see it in her eyes, even from where he stood. As the days went by, Caleb found himself noticing more and more about Emily. He saw her walking around the yard with her son, tending to the small garden she had started. Sometimes she would sit on the porch with her hands folded in her lap, staring out into the distance as though waiting for something, or someone. Caleb didn't know what she was waiting for, but he could feel the weight of it. The sight of her began to haunt him. He wasn't used to feeling this way. Caleb was a man who preferred his own company, someone who found peace in the rhythm of his work. But something about Emily's quiet sadness tugged at him. He wasn't sure why. Maybe it was because she reminded him of the loss he had felt years ago, the way grief could change everything. He had lost his parents in a tragic accident when he was just a teenager, and though time had dulled the pain, it was always there, buried deep inside. But Emily's grief seemed different. She wasn't just mourning the loss of a person, but of a life, of the dreams she had once shared with someone who was now gone. Caleb didn't know the full story, but he could see it in the way she carried herself, the way she tried so hard to keep going, even though it seemed like everything was falling apart. One evening, As Caleb was walking back to his house after a long day of work, he saw Emily standing by the fence again, her gaze fixed on the horizon. This time she wasn't alone. Her son was nowhere in sight, and for the first time, Caleb saw the true depth of her loneliness. Her shoulders were hunched and her hands were pressed against the wooden fence as if trying to hold herself up. The wind blew gently through her hair, but she didn't seem to notice. Caleb's heart ached for her. He stood there for a long moment, unsure of what to do. He wanted to say something, to offer help, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, he just stood there, watching her in silence. Finally, he turned away, walking back to his house without a word. But as he did, something inside him changed. He wasn't sure what it was, but he knew one thing for sure. He couldn't keep ignoring Emily. He wasn't sure what he could do, but maybe, just maybe, he could offer her the one thing she seemed to need most. A little bit of comfort, but that would have to wait. For now, Caleb could only hope that somehow, Emily would find the strength to carry on. The days passed by and the summer heat began to settle into a steady rhythm on the ranch. Caleb's routine remained unchanged. He would wake up early, tend to the cattle, and spend long hours in the fields, working until the sun dipped low in the sky. His life had always been simple, just him and the land. But now, there was a new, almost invisible shift, like a breeze that gently stirs the air without anyone noticing. Emily had become a part of his daily thoughts, even though they hadn't spoken much. He had always been a quiet man, not one for conversation or company. But something about Emily made him feel different. Her presence, so close yet so distant, was a constant reminder of how much he had kept to himself over the years. He often saw her through his window tending to her garden or walking with her son. Her small acts of care for the little farm she had started seemed to mirror the way she was trying to rebuild her life, piece by piece. One evening, after a long day in the fields, Caleb was walking back to his house when he saw Emily standing by the fence again. It was a habit of hers now, Caleb realized, standing there looking out into the distance. The sun was setting behind her, casting a soft orange glow on her face. Her figure, small and delicate, stood out against the vastness of the land. For a moment, Caleb couldn't help but stare. There was a quiet strength in the way she held herself, a grace that reminded him of someone who had weathered many storms and was still standing. As he walked closer, Emily didn't notice him. Her gaze was fixed on the horizon, her thoughts clearly far away. Caleb felt a strange pull, like something was urging him to speak, to break the silence between them. He hesitated for a moment, unsure of how to begin. He had always been the type to keep his distance, never one to intrude on someone else's life. But now, with Emily standing so close, he couldn't shake the feeling that he needed to do something. "Emily," he said, his voice rough from disuse. She turned toward him, surprised but quickly composed herself. Her eyes were a bit red, as if she had been crying. Caleb noticed this but didn't comment on it. He didn't want to make her feel uncomfortable. I've been meaning to ask," Caleb began, his words stumbling out awkwardly. "Do you need any help with the farm? I've got some time tomorrow. If you need help with anything, I can give you a hand." Emily blinked, her surprise turning into something else, something soft, almost relieved. She seemed unsure at first, as though she didn't quite know how to respond to such an offer. Caleb was a quiet man, and she had never expected him to reach out like this. But after a moment she nodded, her lips curling into a small, grateful smile. That would be nice," she replied. Her voice was soft, but there was something sincere in it. Caleb could see that she wasn't used to asking for help. There was a kind of pride in her, a strength that told him she had always tried to do everything on her own, even when it was hard. "I'll be here around 8, Caleb said, giving her a small nod before turning to leave. Emily watched him walk away, her heart strangely light. She hadn't expected Caleb to offer help, but somehow the gesture meant more than words could say. It was as if he had recognized something in her, the weight she carried every day, and had quietly decided to offer his support. The next morning, true to his word, Caleb arrived at Emily's farmhouse at 8 o'clock. She was already outside, standing by the garden, her sleeves rolled up as she worked to pull weeds from the soil. She looked up when she heard his boots on the gravel, and a small smile crossed her face. "Morning," Caleb greeted her, his voice as steady and calm as ever. "Good morning," Emily replied. She looked a little surprised to see him, as if she hadn't expected him to show up. But then again, Emily didn't know much about Caleb other than what she had seen from a distance. Still, she appreciated his offer and was glad that he had kept his word. "So what can I do?" Caleb asked, glancing around. He was used to hard work, and he could tell by the way Emily worked that she was no stranger to it either. But there was only so much one person could do, especially when it came to maintaining a farm on your own. "Well, I've got a few things that need fixing around here," Emily said, brushing her hands on her jeans. "The fence needs mending, and I could use some help clearing the brush in the back. It's a bit much for me to handle on my own." Caleb nodded. "I can handle the fence," he said. He didn't wait for a response before heading toward the broken section of the fence near the barn. Emily stood still for a moment, watching him go. She was used to doing things alone, but now, with Caleb's help, there was a sense of ease she hadn't expected. It felt strange to have someone offer their assistance without asking for anything in return. She didn't know how to explain it, but it was a relief to not have to carry the burden by herself for once. As Caleb worked on the fence, Emily joined him with the brush, her hands moving quickly and efficiently as she cleared the overgrown vegetation. She noticed how quiet it was between them, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that felt natural, the kind that came when two people were working together without the need for constant conversation. Every now and then, Caleb would glance at her, noticing the way she moved with purpose. There was something graceful about her, even in the middle of hard work. He couldn't help but admire her strength, the way she pushed through despite everything she had been through. He wasn't sure why, but there was a connection he felt toward her, a bond that was unspoken, but real all the same. As the day wore on, they continued working in silence, with only the sounds of their work breaking the stillness. The hours seemed to slip by unnoticed, and before long, they had finished the tasks Emily had needed help with. The fence was repaired, the brush cleared, and the garden looked a little neater. Emily stood back and wiped the sweat from her brow, looking at their work with a sense of satisfaction. "Thank you, Caleb," she said, her voice sincere. "I don't know what I would have done without you today." Caleb gave a small nod, his face expressionless as always, but there was a quiet warmth in his eyes. "Glad I could help." As he turned to leave, Emily watched him go, feeling something shift inside her. It wasn't just the work that had changed. There was something deeper, something more meaningful. She hadn't expected Caleb to offer help, much less to do it without any hesitation. It was the kind of kindness that she hadn't received in a long time, and it made her feel seen. She smiled to herself as she walked back to her house. There was a strange comfort in knowing that for once she wasn't alone in this, and that perhaps was just the beginning of something new. The days of late summer drifted lazily by, the heat beginning to soften as the first signs of fall appeared on the horizon. The ranch was quieter now, the cattle grazing lazily in the fields and the nights coming sooner as the light slowly faded. Caleb found comfort in the familiar routine, the steady rhythm of his work. There was something peaceful about it, something that had always grounded him. But as the days passed, his thoughts began to stray more and more often toward Emily. It wasn't that he intended for it to happen. He didn't want to care, didn't want to get involved in her life. But the more time they spent together, the more his feelings for her grew. He noticed the way she smiled at the small things, like when her son laughed as he chased a butterfly, or when she got excited about a new vegetable she had planted in her garden. She had a quiet joy in her that Caleb found hard to ignore, yet Emily wasn't always smiling. Caleb had noticed the moments when her joy faded, when her shoulders slumped, when her smile didn't reach her eyes. There were times, in the quiet of the evening, when she would stand alone at the fence, staring into the distance as though lost in thought, her hands gripping the wood tightly as if she were trying to hold herself together. It was in those moments that Caleb felt a deep ache for her. He knew what it was like to feel alone, to be surrounded by the quiet and yet still be haunted by memories and grief. One evening, as Caleb was finishing his chores, he looked up to see Emily standing near the fence again. The sky above was darkening, the sun just beginning to set in a cascade of pinks and oranges. The sight was beautiful, but it only seemed to highlight the sadness in Emily's eyes. She was standing with her hands clasped in front of her, her back straight, but there was an undeniable tension in the way she held herself, as though the weight of something heavy was pressing down on her. He had seen her like this before, and it always stirred something in him, something protective, something tender that he couldn't quite understand. He had always kept his emotions locked away, buried deep inside, but seeing Emily like this made him want to reach out, to do something, to make her feel less alone. Without thinking, Caleb made his way toward her. His boots crunched against the gravel as he walked, and Emily didn't hear him coming until he was only a few feet away. When she turned and saw him, her face was quickly masked with a polite smile, though her eyes still held a deep sadness. "Hey," Caleb said softly. "You okay?" Emily blinked, clearly surprised by his question. She hadn't expected him to approach, hadn't expected anyone to notice how she had been feeling lately. She had gotten so good at hiding her emotions, at keeping up the appearance of being strong for her son and for the world around her, but deep down the grief had been gnawing at her, slowly eating away at her peace. It had been months since her husband had passed, but the pain still felt as fresh as the day she had lost him. "I'm fine," Emily replied quickly, her voice a little too sharp, a little too forced. She straightened up, trying to appear calm as if nothing was wrong. But Caleb could see the cracks, the way her hands trembled ever so slightly as she gripped the fence. Caleb studied her for a moment, his brow furrowed. He wasn't sure what to say, but he knew that the words he had used before wouldn't be enough this time. He wasn't sure how to help, but there was one thing he could offer: his presence. "Emily, you don't have to pretend," Caleb said, his voice steady but filled with a quiet warmth. "I know it's not easy. You don't have to carry it all by yourself." Her eyes widened slightly, and for a moment she just stood there staring at him, as though she wasn't sure if she had heard him right. No one had ever said that to her before, not in such a simple, sincere way. No one had ever told her that she didn't have to pretend, that she didn't have to hide the weight of her grief behind a smile. It was as though a dam had been broken, and the flood of emotions she had been holding back threatened to spill over. I don't know what to do," Emily whispered, her voice breaking slightly. "I thought I could handle it. I thought I could do it all on my own, but it's harder than I ever imagined." Caleb didn't say anything at first. He simply stepped closer to her, not in an intrusive way, but just enough so that she knew he was there. He wasn't asking for anything. He wasn't pushing her to talk or to explain herself. He was just present, just offering his quiet support. Emily took a shaky breath, and then, before she even realized what she was doing, she whispered, "I took it off, please." Caleb was confused for a moment, unsure of what she meant. It wasn't until he saw the faint glimmer of a ring on her finger, her wedding ring, that he understood. Emily had taken off the ring, the symbol of her past, the symbol of a love that had once filled her heart, was now gone, tucked away in a place she could no longer bear to look at. For the first time since he had known her, Caleb saw the raw vulnerability in Emily's eyes. She wasn't hiding anymore. She wasn't pretending. She was letting the weight of everything she had been carrying, her grief, her loss, her loneliness, spill out in front of him. Caleb didn't know what to say. He wasn't a man of many words, and he had never been good at comforting others. But in that moment, he knew that words weren't what Emily needed. It wasn't advice or solutions that would help her. It was simply someone to stand with her, someone to remind her that she wasn't alone. Without a word, Caleb reached out, his hand slowly coming to rest on hers. The touch was gentle, almost hesitant, but there was an undeniable warmth in it, a connection that both of them felt. Emily looked down at their hands, surprised by the simple gesture, but something inside her shifted. It was as if a small piece of the weight she had been carrying began to lift. "I don't know how to move on," she admitted softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know how to let go." Caleb squeezed her hand just a little bit tighter. He didn't have the answers, and he didn't need to. He couldn't fix what was broken inside of her, but he could offer his presence, his quiet support, and for now that was enough. "You don't have to let go all at once," Caleb said softly, his voice steady and calm. "You can take your time, one day at a time." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The world around them seemed to pause as though holding its breath. The wind rustled through the trees, and the last rays of sunlight cast a warm glow on their faces. In that moment, there was no pressure, no expectation, just two people standing together in the quiet of the evening, finding a sense of comfort in each other's company. Emily closed her eyes, feeling a tear slip down her cheek. She hadn't expected to cry, but she couldn't stop it. She had been so strong for so long, holding everything together for her son, for herself. But here, In this moment, with Caleb standing beside her, it felt like it was finally okay to let go, if only for a little while. Caleb didn't say anything. He simply stood there, his hand resting on hers, offering the only thing he knew how, his quiet, steady presence. And for the first time in months, Emily didn't feel so alone. Part 4. The unspoken touch. The weeks that followed felt different to Caleb. There was a subtle shift in the air, something unspoken between him and Emily that neither of them fully understood yet. It was like the calm before a storm where everything felt still. But there was a sense of change slowly brewing, waiting for the right moment to break through. Caleb continued with his routine on the ranch, waking up early, working the land and taking care of the cattle. But there were moments now when his thoughts would wander. He would find himself thinking about Emily, wondering how she was doing, if she had gotten some rest, or if the weight of her grief was still heavy on her shoulders. He noticed that she seemed to be holding herself together, but there were moments when her eyes betrayed her, a fleeting look of sadness that Caleb could recognize all too well. It wasn't that he was trying to save her. Caleb didn't believe in saving anyone. He had learned that the hard way after losing his own family. No one could fix another person's pain. But there was something about Emily's quiet struggle that resonated with him. He could see how hard she was trying to rebuild her life after losing her husband, and he respected that more than he cared to admit. One evening, as Caleb finished up his chores, he noticed Emily walking across the field toward him. She was carrying a basket, her movement slow but purposeful. The sun was setting, casting a golden light over the land. There was something peaceful about the way Emily walked, as though she had learned to carry the weight of her emotions without letting them consume her. But Caleb could tell that she was still carrying something deep inside. As she approached, Caleb stopped what he was doing and wiped his hands on his jeans. He hadn't seen her in a few days, and though he wasn't sure why, it felt like a small relief to see her again. "Evening, Emily," he said, his voice steady, but with a hint of warmth. "Evening, Caleb," she replied with a smile, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. She stopped a few feet away from him, glancing down at the basket she held in her hands. "I thought I'd bring you some vegetables from the garden," Emily said, her voice soft. "I wasn't sure if you'd need them, but I figured it couldn't hurt." Caleb smiled, though he felt a twinge of guilt for not having thought to ask her if she needed anything in return. He hadn't realized how much he had come to depend on the quiet moments he spent with her. They weren't friends, not in the traditional sense, but there was something about their unspoken understanding that made him feel as though they shared a bond that neither of them needed to explain. "Thank you," he said, taking the basket from her. He could tell it was filled with fresh tomatoes, cucumbers, and even a few herbs. "You've got a good garden here." Emily smiled a little more this time, the corners of her lips lifting as she glanced at the plants behind her. "It's not much, but it keeps me busy." The conversation felt easy between them, more comfortable than it had ever been before. Caleb had always been a man of few words, but there was something about Emily's presence that made him feel like he could be himself. He didn't need to pretend, didn't need to hide behind his usual walls. And for Emily, Caleb's quiet nature was a relief. She didn't need to explain herself or constantly worry about what to say. He accepted her for who she was, even in her most vulnerable moments. "Would you like some coffee?" Emily asked, almost as an afterthought, as though she were offering the simplest of gestures. "I could make us both a cup." Caleb hesitated for a moment, but then nodded. "I'd like that." The two of them walked toward the small porch of Emily's farmhouse, the sound of their footsteps crunching on the gravel beneath them. As they sat down on the old wooden chairs, Caleb couldn't help but notice how the evening seemed to settle around them, wrapping them in a sense of calm. The air was cool now, and the sky above them was beginning to darken, the first stars beginning to twinkle in the distance. Emily went inside to make the coffee, leaving Caleb alone for a moment on the porch. He leaned back in the chair, his eyes drifting over the fields that stretched out before him. The ranch had always been his place of solitude, a place where he could escape from the noise of the world. But lately it hadn't felt so lonely. There was something about Emily's quiet presence, the way she filled the space without saying much, that made everything feel a little more bearable. When Emily returned with 2 steaming cups of coffee, she sat down beside him. The warmth of the mug in Caleb's hands felt good against the cool evening air, and he took a sip, savoring the rich taste. "Thank you," he said again, his voice quieter now, more reflective. Emily nodded, taking a sip of her own coffee. She looked out over the fields, her gaze soft as she took in the beauty of the moment. There was a quiet peace in the air, one that neither of them had expected to find in the midst of their struggles. For a while, neither of them spoke. It was the kind of silence that didn't feel awkward, but instead comfortable, like two people sitting together not needing words to communicate what was in their hearts. Caleb could feel the weight of the day lifting, the tension that had been building inside him slowly melting away. Emily, too, seemed to be breathing more easily, as though the simple act of sitting together was enough to ease some of the burden she had been carrying. As the night grew darker, Caleb shifted slightly in his chair. He didn't know why, but he found himself wanting to say something more, to break the silence in a way that felt meaningful. It wasn't that he felt an urgent need to confess something. It was just that the quiet had become too much for him to bear. The connection between them had deepened, and he could feel the pull between them, the unspoken bond that was growing stronger with each passing day. Without thinking, Caleb reached out, his hand gently brushing against hers. It was a small gesture, but it sent a wave of warmth through both of them. Emily looked up in surprise, her eyes meeting his for the first time that evening. There was a softness in her gaze, a quiet understanding that spoke volumes. Neither of them said anything, but in that moment the touch between them felt like the beginning of something new, something unspoken but real. Emily's heart raced as she looked at Caleb. She hadn't expected this, hadn't expected him to reach out in such a quiet, tender way. But now that he had, she felt a warmth spread through her chest, a sense of connection that she hadn't felt in so long. It wasn't love, not yet, but it was something that felt just as important. Trust, comfort, and the beginning of something she wasn't sure she was ready for, but couldn't deny. For the first time in months, Emily allowed herself to feel something more than grief. She allowed herself to be open to the possibility of something new, something that could grow from the quiet moments they shared. Caleb's presence was a steady anchor, one that didn't demand anything from her but simply offered his company, his understanding. And in that moment, as their hands lingered together, Emily realized something important. She wasn't alone anymore. The days seemed to stretch on, each one blending into the next like a gentle tide washing against the shore. The air was cooling now as the first signs of autumn began to paint the sky in soft shades of orange and gold. The ranch was quieter than ever, and yet Caleb noticed that it didn't feel quite as lonely. He couldn't quite explain it, but something had shifted between him and Emily. It had been weeks since that evening on the porch, when their hands had brushed together and that small, quiet connection had sparked something in both of them. They hadn't spoken much about it, but neither had they ignored it. Their moments together had become more frequent, though always simple. They worked side by side on the ranch, mended fences, planted crops, and shared more than just chores. They shared moments of silence, of understanding, of being there for each other without needing to explain why. Caleb still kept much to himself, but now there were moments when his thoughts would wander to Emily, how she smiled when her son brought her a wildflower, or how she seemed to pause for just a moment at sunset, looking out over the land. She had always been strong, always trying to keep it together, but there were times when he could see the weight of her grief, the times when she would stand at the fence lost in thought, the same sadness in her eyes. But Caleb knew that Emily was beginning to heal. Slowly, imperceptibly, like the way the seasons change, quietly, with small steps, Emily was finding her way again. One late afternoon, Caleb was working near the barn when he saw Emily coming toward him. She was walking slowly, her son trailing behind her as usual, running after the few chickens that had wandered out of the coop. Emily waved to Caleb as she approached, a smile on her face. It wasn't the faint, forced smile that Caleb had seen so often before. This one was real, bright, and full of something more than just politeness. "Afternoon, Caleb," Emily called, her voice full of warmth. "Afternoon, Emily," Caleb replied, giving her a nod. He wiped his brow, wiping away the sweat from the long day. He hadn't expected to see her out here, but there was something about the way she looked today that caught his attention. There was a calmness about her, a kind of peace that Caleb hadn't seen before. "I was thinking," Emily began, pausing for a moment before continuing. "Maybe it's time to expand the garden. I've been reading a little, and there's more I can plant before winter comes. Would you be willing to help me with it? I know it's a lot of work, but I think it could be nice, you know. Caleb was surprised by the question. Emily had always been independent, always trying to handle things on her own. It was rare for her to ask for help, let alone to admit that she needed it. Caleb knew she had a lot of pride, and he admired that about her. But it was different now. It wasn't about needing to do things on her own anymore. It was about sharing the burden, sharing the work, and even more importantly, sharing moments together. "Of course," Caleb said without hesitation. "I'll help you with it. We can get started tomorrow if you'd like." Emily smiled, and the warmth in her eyes made something inside Caleb stir. It was a smile that wasn't weighed down by the past, a smile that was born out of something lighter, something hopeful. It was a smile that made Caleb realize just how far they had come, how far she had come. The next morning, the sun had risen early, and the light was soft as Caleb and Emily worked together in the garden. They didn't speak much, but the work felt effortless. Caleb could see the joy in Emily's face as she planted seeds and turned the soil. Her son ran around them picking up rocks and pretending to herd the chickens, his laughter echoing through the air. Caleb had never been one for children, but he found himself watching the boy with a quiet fondness, wondering what it would have been like if things had been different, if his own life had been a little different. For the first time in a long while, Caleb didn't feel the weight of the past hanging over him. He had lived with his memories for so long, trying to bury them beneath the work, trying to fill the silence with anything that could keep him from facing what had been lost. But now, as he worked alongside Emily, as they shared simple, quiet moments, he realized that he had been living in the past for too long. There was a future ahead of him, one that he hadn't allowed himself to see until now. As the day wore on, the garden began to take shape. Emily's son had joined them, excitedly showing off his tiny collection of rocks and flowers. Caleb found himself laughing, not in a forced way, but in a genuine, easy way. Emily had brought a lightness to his life that he hadn't known he needed. By the end of the day, they had planted the new crops, cleared out the remaining weeds, and set up a small area for herbs. Emily stood back, her hands on her hips as she surveyed the work they had done. Her face was flushed from the work, but there was a contentment in her eyes that Caleb had never seen before. "I think it looks great," Emily said, her voice filled with pride. "Thank you, Caleb. I really appreciate your help." Caleb glanced at her, his heart strangely full. It wasn't just the work that mattered. It was the way they had done it together, the way they had built something with their hands, piece by piece. It wasn't just about the garden. It was about what it represented. New beginnings, shared moments, and a future that was slowly taking shape. "You don't need to thank me," Caleb said, his voice low, but full of sincerity. "I'm happy to help. You've done a lot on your own, but it's nice to see you starting to trust again." Emily looked at him, surprised by the words. She hadn't realized how much she had started to trust him until that moment. There was a certain truth in what Caleb had said, and it made her heart swell with something she hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. The next few weeks passed by in much the same way. Caleb and Emily continued working together side by side. It wasn't always easy. There were still hard days, days when grief would creep in and the weight of the past would make itself known. But there were also days filled with laughter, with small moments of peace and quiet understanding. And slowly, very slowly, their bond deepened. One evening, as they sat on the porch after a long day, Caleb felt something shift inside him. It wasn't a single moment, but a quiet realization that had been building over time. He wasn't sure when it had happened, but he knew now that he had found something he hadn't known he was looking for. A place, a person, a life that felt like it was his to build. Emily looked over at him, her smile soft and knowing. She had come a long way from the woman who had stood alone at the fence, burdened by grief and loss. She had started to see the possibility of a new life, one where healing was possible, and where love could grow again, slowly, but surely. "I think we're starting to get somewhere," Emily said softly. Her eyes meeting Caleb's, Caleb nodded, a quiet smile tugging at the corners of his lips. "Yeah, I think we are." And for the first time in a long time, Caleb allowed himself to believe in a future that was full of promise, a future that had just begun.